The words landed the way a fist does, not with sound, but with impact. I'm Claire. Claire Weston. I'm 41 years old. I'm an estate attorney, and I've spent the better part of my career helping other families navigate exactly the kind of wreckage that was now unfolding in my mother's dining room, 40 minutes after her funeral. My sister Dana said it quietly. That was the thing no one tells you about cruelty from someone who knows you. It doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives in a measured tone, in a room that smells like sympathy casseroles and too many flowers, while your 9-year-old daughter is 3 feet away pretending to read a sympathy card. You were never in the will, Claire. Mom changed it 14 months ago. I thought you knew. She said, I thought you knew the way you say, I thought you'd already eaten, as if the information were inconsequential, as if she were correcting a minor misunderstanding about dinner reservations rather than informing me that my mother had apparently decided, in the last year of her life, to cut me out of everything. I didn't say anything. Not immediately. Something locked up inside me, not grief, not yet. Something colder than grief. I had sat across from enough clients in conference rooms to recognize the particular stillness that precedes a complete reordering of reality. I had watched people receive information that invalidated years of their life. I had handed them tissues and walked them through their options and told them, gently, that the law is not the same thing as fairness. I had never expected to be the one sitting on the receiving end. My mother, Patricia Weston, had died on a Tuesday. Cardiac arrest, swift and unannounced, in the kitchen of the house she'd lived in for 37 years. She was 73. She had seemed, the last time I visited, Thanksgiving, 4 months ago, entirely herself. Sharp, particular about her routines, annoyed at the neighbor's new fence. Not a woman rearranging her affairs. Not a woman saying goodbye. I had kissed her cheek at the door and driven back to Harlow Falls with Mia asleep in the back seat, thinking nothing more profound than that I needed to call her more. Now I was standing in her dining room, holding a cup of tea I hadn't wanted, and my sister was telling me that the house, the investment accounts, the contents of 43 years of our mother's life, all of it, had been left entirely to Dana. Mia looked up from the card she was holding. Just for a second. Then she looked back down. I'd like to see the document, I said. Dana's expression shifted, not much, just a small tightening around the eyes. Of course. I'll have Howard send you a copy. Howard Blaine was the family's longtime attorney. I knew him slightly. He had a practice in Denton, handled mostly small estates and property transfers, and had been drafting documents for my parents for as long as I could remember. The idea that he had overseen this change without mentioning it to me, without so much as a phone call, settled in my stomach like a stone. When did you say it was changed? 14 months ago. March, I think. Maybe February. She reached past me to refill her tea from the pot on the sideboard, her movements completely composed. Mom didn't want it to be a thing. She knew you'd make it a thing. She knew you'd make it a thing. That sentence has lived in my head ever since. Not because it hurt, though it did, but because of how precisely it was designed to. It preemptively framed any response I might have as an overreaction. It made my grief into evidence of a character flaw. And it was delivered within minutes of a funeral, when I had no resources to push back and an audience of extended family moving quietly through the next room. Looking back, that was when I should have understood that this conversation had been prepared. Dana had thought about it. She had chosen the moment, the setting, the phrasing. She had waited until I was standing in a house that no longer had any legal connection to me, surrounded by people I hadn't seen in years, with my daughter 3 feet away. I set my cup down on the sideboard. I'll wait to hear from Howard, I said. And I walked into the next room to find Mia. But something had already shifted. Some quiet, professional part of my brain, the part that had read thousands of documents, spotted the overlooked clause, noticed the signature that didn't quite match, had come fully awake. Harlow Falls is the kind of town that looks like it hasn't made a decision in 30 years. The same hardware store on the corner of Mill and 4th. The same diner with the same cracked vinyl on the same 4 stools. I had grown up 40 minutes north in Denton and moved to Harlow Falls 11 years ago when my ex-husband Marcus got the teaching position at the college. We divorced when Mia was 3. He moved to Portland. I stayed because Mia's school was good and my practice was established and, if I'm honest, because inertia can look a lot like choice when you're tired enough. My office was above a bookstore on Clement Street. 2 rooms, a part-time assistant named Priya who worked Tuesdays and Thursdays, a filing system that was better than it looked. I specialized in estate planning and probate work, not glamorous, but steady, and it suited a certain part of my personality that liked things to be in order, documented, resolved. I was good at what I did. That isn't vanity. It's relevant. In the week after the funeral, I did what I always do when I don't know what to do. I worked. I drafted 3 wills, reviewed 2 trust agreements, attended a deposition for a contested estate in a neighboring county. I picked Mia up from school every afternoon at 3:15. I made dinner. I answered Dana's texts, which arrived with suspicious regularity, checking in, asking how I was holding up, forwarding photographs of the house's contents with cheerful captions like, "Thought you might want some of Mom's things before I figure out storage." The will arrived by email from Howard Blaine's office on a Thursday morning, 11 days after the funeral. I opened it at my desk. Read it twice. Then I read it a third time, slowly, the way I read documents when something doesn't fit. It was properly formatted. The signatures were dated February 14th of the prior year, Valentine's Day, which struck me as odd, but wasn't impossible. 2 witnesses, a woman named Renata Ochoa and a man named Gerald Fitch. Howard Blaine as the drafting attorney. Patricia and Weston as testator, leaving the entirety of her estate, the house on Carmichael Street, valued at approximately $340,000, along with savings and investment accounts totaling roughly $535,000 to her eldest daughter, Dana Lynn Weston. No mention of me. No conditional bequest. No explanatory language. I sat with that for a long time. It wasn't the money that caught in my chest, though I won't pretend the numbers were insignificant. It was the completeness of the erasure. Most people, when they alter a will, include something, a token bequest, a line of explanation, a personal property item attached to a memory. My mother had left me the dedication in the front of her recipe book, the cheap silverware we'd used every day, the things that live in the corners of a kitchen. The absence of even that felt intentional. But the document was clean. No immediate irregularities in the formatting. No obvious red flags. No obvious ones. I did something I normally advise clients not to do. I kept looking. Not because I had decided it was fraudulent. I hadn't. But I was an attorney, and the document had my name absent from it, and I told myself, simply doing due diligence. I called a colleague in Columbus, a woman named Sasha who had far more experience with contested wills than I did, and described the situation in hypothetical terms. She walked me through the standard avenues. Undue influence. Lack of testamentary capacity. Fraud or forgery. The bar for each was significant. Family members contest wills constantly and mostly lose. She reminded me, the law is deeply resistant to second-guessing a person's stated final wishes. But, she said, if you genuinely believe something's wrong, start with the witnesses. I wrote that down. Start with the witnesses. It was a quiet thought at that point. A professional instinct, nothing more. I had no particular reason to believe anything was wrong beyond the fact that something felt wrong, and feelings are not evidence. Mia asked me that evening, while I was making pasta, if Aunt Dana was going to sell Grandma's house. Probably, I said. She was quiet for a moment. She already asked the neighbor if he wanted to buy the porch furniture. I turned from the stove. When did she tell you that? She didn't. I heard her on the phone at the reception. Mia stirred her water glass with her straw, not looking up. She was on the phone in Grandma's bedroom. I went in to get my jacket. I didn't ask her anything else. She was 9, and she had just lost her grandmother, and it wasn't her job to be my source of information. But I stood at that stove for another minute after the pasta was done, not moving, turning that small detail over. The reception was the day of the funeral. Dana had apparently been on the phone arranging the sale of porch furniture on the day of our mother's funeral. That detail seemed insignificant at the time. It wasn't. Renata Ochoa wasn't hard to find. She was 56 years old, lived in Denton, worked part-time at a dental office on Briar Road. She had, according to her Facebook profile, known my mother through a church quilting group that met on Wednesday evenings. There were photographs, group shots with fabric squares and bad lighting, and my mother's unmistakable profile at the edge of one of them, taken roughly 2 years before she died. I didn't contact Renata immediately. I contacted Howard Blaine first. His office manager, a very efficient woman named Lori, informed me that Mr. Blaine was on an extended leave of absence for a health matter and was not available for consultations. She was sorry for my loss. She would pass along my message. He did not call back. I tried twice more over the following week. Same response. Then I called a friend, or who I thought was a friend, which is a distinction I will come back to. Her name was Beth Crawley. We had been close for nearly 8 years. She was a paralegal at a firm in Denton, and she and I had the particular easy intimacy of women who meet in their 30s after their most dramatic decisions have already been made, who can be honest with each other about their imperfect lives without fear of judgment. I trusted her completely. I asked her, carefully and without sharing my suspicions directly, whether she knew anything about Howard Blaine's practice, his reputation, any recent matters. She said she didn't know much. She'd heard he was in poor health. She asked how I was doing with the grief. I told her I was managing. I said I was having some questions about the will. "Oh, Claire," she said. "Don't do this to yourself. I'm just looking into a few things." I know what looking into a few things means for you. There was something gentle in her voice, something careful. It means you're going to work yourself into the ground trying to find something wrong because you can't accept that your mom made a choice you didn't expect. I remember sitting with the phone against my ear, looking out the window at the street below my office and feeling briefly ashamed. As if she had correctly diagnosed a form of denial, a professional reflex dressed up as grief. I didn't ask. Not because I didn't want to know, but because something in her tone made me feel like I should stop. That instinct to stop was the most dangerous one I had. I almost obeyed it. Instead, I called Renata Ochoa on a Wednesday afternoon. She picked up on the third ring. I introduced myself as Patricia Weston's daughter, mentioned the will, said I was trying to confirm some administrative details. My voice was pleasant and unhurried. Professional. I'd made calls like this hundreds of times. There was a pause on her end. "I was wondering if someone might call," she said. That pause. That sentence. I felt something move in my chest, not vindication, not yet. More like the sensation of a knot beginning to loosen somewhere important. "Can you walk me through the signing?" I asked. She could. She did. She had met my mother twice at the quilting group. She had been called by Howard Blaine's office and asked if she'd be willing to serve as a witness for will signing. It happened occasionally. The office called on a small group of trusted community members for exactly that purpose. She had agreed. She had gone to the office on the 14th of February and signed where she was told to sign. Was my mother there? I asked. Another pause. Longer. There was a woman there, Renata said carefully. She was signing the document. I witnessed the signature. I didn't. I wasn't introduced formally. I assumed it was your mother. I kept my voice completely level. Can you describe her? She described a woman in her mid to late 60s, medium height, silver hair worn short, a dark green cardigan. My mother had worn her hair long her entire life. It was silver, yes, but long, pulled back or pinned, always. Short hair was never something she had considered, not in any version of herself I had ever known. I had a photograph on my desk, taken the previous Christmas, where her hair reached past her collar. I thanked Renata. I told her I might need to follow up. I ended the call, and I sat in my office chair for approximately 3 minutes without moving. Then I opened my desk drawer and took out a legal pad. The thing about evidence in a contested estate case is that it almost never announces itself. It accumulates. It accretes like sediment, one thin layer at a time, until the weight of it becomes undeniable. I knew this professionally. I was now learning it personally. I wrote down everything I had. The will was dated February 14th. I found, after 2 days of calls to the quilting group's informal social media page, that the Wednesday group had met that evening, a Valentine's Day social with a potluck. My mother had been present. I had a comment thread to prove it, with 2 separate members mentioning her by name, one of them noting she had brought the lemon cake she always made. She had been at a quilting group potluck on the evening of February 14th. The will was signed, according to the document, at 3:30 in the afternoon. Renata had witnessed someone else's signature. Gerald Fitch, the second witness, was harder to locate. He had no social media presence. He appeared in Howard Blaine's general vicinity, a former client, according to county property records where both names appeared in a transfer from several years back. I left him a voicemail. He did not return it. I requested my mother's medical records from her primary care physician's office. This required a formal records request and a small demonstration of my legal standing as a family member. I was careful, methodical, and correct in my procedure. I was not going to give anyone reason to question my process. The records arrived on a Friday. I read them at home after Mia went to sleep. My mother had been diagnosed, 14 months prior to her death, with early-stage vascular dementia. The diagnosis was noted matter-of-factly in a clinical summary. There were follow-up appointments, a referral to a neurologist, medication adjustments. The notes described a woman experiencing periodic confusion, difficulty with sequencing, some short-term memory loss. She had been experiencing cognitive decline at the time the will was allegedly signed. I sat at my kitchen table with those records for a long time. The grief that came was different from the grief at the funeral, quieter, and in some ways worse. My mother had been losing herself, and I hadn't known. Or I had known something was slightly off. The Thanksgiving visit, the way she had repeated herself twice about the neighbor's fence, the moment she called Mia by a wrong name, and then laughed it off, and I had filed those things away as age, as a hard year, as nothing to worry about yet. Looking back, those weren't isolated moments. They were a pattern I had chosen not to complete. I hadn't been protecting my mother from the knowledge that something was wrong. I had been protecting myself from the obligation to act. That realization cost me something. I'm not sure I fully paid it yet. I called Sasha in Columbus on a Monday morning and told her everything. Not in hypotheticals this time. She listened without interrupting, which was how I knew she thought it was serious. "You have a potential fraud case," she said. "Possibly elder abuse. Definitely capacity issues. The witness problem alone is significant." "I know. Who drafted the document?" "Howard Blaine is implicated if someone signed in your mother's place. He's on leave. Health reasons, supposedly." Or, Sasha said quietly, "He knows someone's coming." I hadn't considered that Howard Blaine might be anything other than an unwitting participant, a competent but insufficiently careful attorney who had been manipulated by my sister. The possibility that he was an active participant reconfigured everything. If he was involved, this wasn't an impulsive act. It was coordinated. It had required planning, access, and someone willing to impersonate an elderly woman with dementia. I thought about who had access to my mother in those final years. Who visited most? Who was present for her appointments? Dana lived 20 minutes from the house. I lived 40 minutes away. Dana had, over the past 3 years as our mother's health declined in ways I was now understanding had been more significant than I realized, gradually positioned herself as the primary caretaker. She drove my mother to appointments. She managed the grocery shopping. She had, at some point, been added to my mother's bank accounts as a co-signatory. She had been building infrastructure, quietly, methodically, over years. I understood then something I hadn't wanted to understand. I hadn't been absent from my mother's life. I had been made to feel like a visitor in it. The small, consistent erosions, Dana mentioning that Mom seemed tired when I called at the wrong time, Dana suggesting my visits were sometimes stressful for her, Dana managing the communication, controlling the access. It hadn't felt like exclusion. It had felt like my sister being competent at something I should probably also be doing, and the resulting guilt had kept me at a careful distance, not wanting to disrupt the arrangements that seemed to be working. I needed the original document. Not the emailed copy, the wet signature original, which by Ohio law had to be retained either by the drafting attorney or the probate court. I filed a formal records request with the county probate court. 3 days later, the court's office called me back. No will from Patricia Weston had been filed with their office. I called Dana on a Thursday evening. Mia was at her father's for the weekend. Marcus had driven up from Columbus, a custody arrangement we had managed, over the years, to make functional if not warm. I was grateful, that evening, that the house was quiet. Dana answered on the second ring. "I need to talk to you about the will," I said. "Claire." A breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. I knew this was coming. "Then you'll be prepared. The will hasn't been filed with probate court. There's no original on record. Howard Blaine's office is unresponsive. And the woman who signed as Patricia Weston on February 14th was not our mother. Our mother was at a quilting social that evening, and she had short hair in the document signing, which she never had in her life." Silence. Not the silence of someone processing unexpected information. The silence of someone deciding what to say next. "You're making accusations," Dana said finally. "I'm telling you what I found. You're grieving and you're turning it into a legal project because that's what you do. You can't just feel something, you have to." "Our mother had vascular dementia," I said. "It was diagnosed 14 months ago. You knew. You were taking her to those appointments. She lacked testamentary capacity at the time that document was purportedly signed. Which means even if the signature were genuine, the document wouldn't hold." Another silence. Longer. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she said, and there was something different in her voice now. The warmth was gone. The performance of sisterly exhaustion. What remained was flatter, harder. "I'm letting you know what I've found before I take it to the Ohio Attorney General's Elder Abuse Unit. And before I file a motion in probate court. You have nothing. I have a witness who describes someone other than our mother. I have medical records establishing cognitive incapacity. I have a missing original. I have a bank co-signatory arrangement that allowed you to access her accounts for the past 3 years. I paused. "I also have her bank statements, Dana. I requested them as part of my records process. Transfers began 26 months ago. Small amounts at first. Then larger. By the end, you had moved approximately $180,000 out of her accounts over a 2-year period." The silence this time was different. "Total." "Those were gifts," she said. Her voice had changed again, tighter, controlled, slightly too careful. "She gave them to me freely. A woman with vascular dementia, under your exclusive care, gave you $180,000 in transfers with no corresponding documentation, no written gift letters, no tax filings. Over 2 years. While systematically reducing my access to her." I stopped. "I don't think you want me to present that to a judge." I heard her breathing. "What do you want?" she said at last. It wasn't a question. "I want what was hers," I said. "And I want to know who signed that document." She didn't answer. "I'm filing Monday," I said. "If you have anything to tell me, the time is now." She told me. It came out in pieces, over 40 minutes, without apology and without much emotion, the flat accounting of someone who has already separated themselves from the morality of what they've done. She had arranged for a woman to sign. A friend of Howard's, someone who owed him a favor. Renata had been called as a witness without being told clearly who she was witnessing. Gerald Fitch had been less careful about asking questions. Howard Blaine had drafted the document and had, according to Dana, been convinced that our mother had expressed these wishes verbally over many months, that the dementia was minor, that this was simply her genuine intent made formal. She had told him she was protecting their mother's wishes from a daughter who had abandoned her. I wrote down every word. Then there was the thing I hadn't anticipated. "Beth knew," Dana said. Quiet, almost offhand. "She's known since April. I needed someone to. She was worried about you. She thought you might. She was trying to protect you from finding out." I kept writing. I kept my voice level. Inside, something that I had believed was solid and reliable shifted in a way I hadn't budgeted for. Beth. 8 years. The woman who had told me, gently, not to do this to myself. Who had asked how I was holding up with the grief. Who had known the whole time. I realized I hadn't been maintaining a friendship. I had been funding one with trust, with honesty, with the assumption that it was mutual. That assumption had been one-sided for longer than I wanted to calculate. I ended the call. The next morning, I called Sasha, then the Ohio Attorney General's Elder Abuse Unit, then the county probate court. On the following Monday, I filed. The case took 11 months. That is the unglamorous reality of legal proceedings. They are slow, documentary, unglamorous. There is no single dramatic moment in a courtroom. There are depositions and discovery requests and motions and continuances, and a great deal of time waiting for responses from people who are doing everything they can to delay the inevitable. Howard Blaine, it turned out, was not on leave for health reasons. He was cooperating with an investigation that had been opened by the Ohio State Bar. He had, when it became clear that cooperation was his best option, provided a detailed account of what had occurred. He had not known, he claimed, that the woman who signed was not Patricia Weston. He had relied on Dana's representations entirely. His failure to follow standard verification procedures was catastrophic, professionally. His license was suspended pending further proceedings. The woman who had signed as my mother was identified. She was 64, a former neighbor of Howard's with a passing resemblance to the woman I had not known was disappearing. She cooperated in exchange for reduced charges. Dana's attorney negotiated. There was, in the end, no trial, a settlement, a formal renunciation of the fraudulent will, and a civil judgment ordering the return of the transferred funds plus interest, totaling just over $875,000 when all accounts were considered. A portion of that money went to legal fees. The house was sold. What remained was placed in an account that I used, partly to establish a college fund for Mia and partly to donate to an organization that works with families navigating elder financial abuse. The family, all 127 of them who had been in that house on the day Dana told me I had never been in the will, the aunts and cousins and family friends who had moved through the rooms that afternoon eating sympathy casseroles. Most of them learned what had happened through the county courthouse records. It is a small county. News moves. Dana did not go to prison. That is a complicated fact that I have made my peace with imperfectly. The criminal proceedings resulted in a plea to a lesser charge, probation, community service. The law is not the same thing as fairness. I told myself this many times during those 11 months. I have not spoken to Beth since the night Dana said her name. Beth called me twice in the following weeks. I did not answer. She sent an email that was 4 paragraphs long and used the word complicated 7 times. I read it once and did not respond. I don't think of myself as an unforgiving person, but I am clear about the difference between a mistake and a sustained choice. What Beth did was not a lapse in judgment. It was a decision, made over months, to prioritize her relationship with Dana, which I later discovered was older and closer than I had understood, over her honesty with me. She let me sit in a therapist's office processing grief, while she knew the grief had been manufactured. That is not something I know how to step over. Mia asked me once, during those 11 months, whether I was angry at Aunt Dana. I thought about it honestly. Yes, I said. But it's changing into something else. What? I'm not sure yet. She accepted that. 9-year-olds are more comfortable with unresolved answers than we give them credit for. What it changed into, eventually, was a kind of clarity. Dana had wanted what my mother had. I understood that, not excused it, but understood it. She had spent years watching our mother, doing the daily labor of care, and had convinced herself along the way that the labor entitled her to the reward. She had told herself a story in which my distance made me undeserving, and she had told that story so often and so completely that she had eventually arranged reality to match it. That is not unusual. That is, in fact, something I have seen in contested estate work more times than I can count. People do not generally set out to become fraudsters. They set out to correct what they have decided is an injustice, and the correction, if unchecked, swallows everything. I live in Harlow Falls still. My office is still above the bookstore on Clement Street. Priya works 3 days a week now, not 2, because the practice has grown. I have a second room. Some mornings I drive past the diner on Mill and 4th and think about how much I took for granted, not just my mother's life, but my understanding of the people around me. The certainty that the documents in front of me represented reality. The faith that the people I trusted had earned it. I am more careful now. Not more cynical, careful. There is a difference. The last thing in my mother's estate, the one item Dana had not gotten to first because it had been stored in a box in the basement that she apparently hadn't found worth examining, was a shoebox of letters. Correspondence from my mother's own mother, from the 1970s, bound with a rubber band that had gone brittle. There were 43 letters. They were addressed to my mother. They were full of ordinary news, garden updates, neighborhood gossip, the price of things, and at the end of each one, a line or two of quiet affection. I read them in an afternoon. Mia sat beside me on the couch and read a few too. "She sounds nice," Mia said, about the grandmother she had never met. "She was," I said. I put the letters back in the box. I put the box on the shelf in my home office, next to the photograph from Christmas, next to the ones from Mia's school plays and birthday parties, and the one afternoon we drove out to see the lake when the ice was still on it. That shelf is the truest version of what I inherited. There is a particular kind of betrayal that is especially hard to name, not the dramatic, sudden kind, but the one that was built slowly, with care over years. The one that required patience and planning and a sustained willingness to see another person as an obstacle rather than a human being. What Dana did to her mother and her sister wasn't born in a moment of desperation. It was constructed, piece by piece, through a long process of positioning herself as indispensable and Mia's peripheral. By the time she made her move, the architecture was already in place, the caregiving routines, the bank access, the managed distances, the controlled communications. Claire hadn't been excluded from her mother's life suddenly. She had been walked backward out of it so gradually she hadn't noticed the door closing. What the story ultimately reveals isn't really about greed, or not only about that. It's about the way long-term resentment, when it goes unaddressed, becomes permission. Dana had spent years performing a role, dutiful daughter, present caretaker, that she may have genuinely inhabited at first. But somewhere along the way, the role became a ledger. Every casserole, every medical appointment, every inconvenient holiday was entered on one side. Claire's relative absence was entered on the other. By the time the ledger felt unbalanced enough to act on, Dana had spent so long constructing her internal justification that the fraud felt, to her, like a correction. The elder abuse dimension of this story is one that tends to be invisible until it isn't. Patricia's dementia was real. Her vulnerability was real. And the person closest to her, the one who had the most access, who had shaped the conditions of her final years, was the person with the most to gain from her incapacity. The law has frameworks for this. They're imperfect. But the story shows something the law can't fully capture: how long it takes to see exploitation when it's wearing the face of love. Claire's professional training both helped and complicated her path. It helped because she knew what evidence looked like, knew how to read documents, knew the questions to ask. It complicated things because it made her initially self-conscious about what she was doing. She was aware that grief and legal instinct can look similar from the outside, and that awareness made her hesitate. Death exploited that hesitation. She weaponized Claire's self-doubt, using the language of emotional care to nudge her away from exactly the inquiry that would have uncovered the truth earlier. That is worth sitting with. The most effective way to stop someone from finding the truth isn't to destroy the evidence. It's to make them feel foolish for looking. And the final twist, that it was the absence of a document, a missing original, that cracked the whole structure open, is quietly ironic for an estate attorney. The fraud collapsed not because of dramatic evidence, but because someone hadn't filed the paperwork. What I keep coming back to, thinking about this story, is the shoebox of letters in the basement. Everything else was contested: the money, the house, the relationships, the truth of what had happened. But those 43 letters from one woman to her daughter, full of garden news and grocery prices and quiet love, no one had thought to take those. Maybe because they had no monetary value. Maybe because the person doing the taking had stopped thinking about what actually mattered. We spend so much energy protecting ourselves from loss that sometimes we don't notice what we're losing in the process of protection. Dana lost her sister long before the legal case was filed. She lost her mother, in a way, the moment she started managing her as an asset. And she lost whatever she might have been if she had just let herself grieve a difficult life without deciding that grief entitled her to take something. The letters were there the whole time, waiting in the basement. Nobody had to steal them.